well, a few fundamental questions. If so, if these documents are genuine, who leaked them? I have no doubt that they were leaked now by people within the Pentagon. In fact, I'm going to make a guess. I think this was a carefully planned, authorized leak, authorized by somebody very important with access to this kind of information and probably widely discussed. I have spoken previously about the fact that there's clearly been an argument going on at the highest levels of the US government. We got the first indications of this with the publication of that Rand Corporation study some weeks ago, which said that the United States could not afford a prolonged war in Ukraine. A prolonged war in Ukraine was contrary to US interests. And there were other studies from all sorts of places. There's a study from the CSIS about, in fact, there's been more than one study, about US ammunition and weapon system shortages, that this war is intensifying. I've also received, there's also been lots of reports about the fact that the Europeans are no longer able to sustain support for Ukraine at the necessary levels. It seems that the plan to supply Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells from the European Union has now collapsed. It's not going to happen. It seems also that the plan to supply Ukraine with large numbers of MiG-29 fighters has also collapsed. Slovakia is complaining that the MiG-29s, its MiG-29s, some of them are in very poor condition. They may not be flyable. Bulgaria is now saying that it's not going to supply MiG-29s at all. And there are reports coming out of Bulgaria that the MiG-29s that it does have, some of them are not in flyable condition, and those which are would probably only be able to keep flying until the end of the year, because without Russian technical support, they can't be maintained for long. So all these problems, all starting to accumulate. And there's been more reports about problems with JDAM bombs. These are the American precision-guided bombs, which the Ukrainian MiG-29s were expected to use. And it looks as if these aren't working out very well either. And there's been discussion, apparently there's been some agonizing as to why this is going on, why the Russians are able to use precision-guided bombs with such effectiveness in Ukraine, whereas the Ukrainians with American, comparable American bombs are not. And again, it's been suggested that the Russians have found some way to jam the GPS signals that operate these bombs. I'm not going to even try to guess whether that's true or not, that there are also problems with fusing and all kinds of things. I suspect there's a lot of compatibility issues. Trying to launch bombs of this kind from rickety old Soviet planes left over from the 1980s. I've discussed before that it seemed to me, well, perhaps not an impossible thing to do, but one which would present huge problems if done in the limited time that the offensive allowed for. So all of this information is piling out. It's clear that Ukraine is not going to be able to rebuild its army if its army is going to be destroyed in this offensive, as it looks like it will be. And it looks as if the Pentagon itself doesn't believe that this offensive can achieve anything more than modest gains. So why go ahead with it? Well, I've discussed this many times, and as I said, I come back to my point about the fact that there's clearly a conflict underway in the United States between the more realistic people, the uniformed military people in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and their various sub-agencies, and to some extent, as is now clear, in the US intelligence community, and by contrast, officials in the State Department and the National Security Council and the White House. And it's the latter officials, people like Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, and of course the President himself, who, having launched the United States into this war, cannot now pull back from it. And they are determined to have this offensive happen, despite all of the advice from the experts that it's not a good idea. And we saw the same thing happen with the sanctions, the freezing of the Russian central bank's reserves, the cut-off of Russian banks from SWIFT, all of those things, the oil price caps. The experts were united in advising against these moves. They were done anyway, and now the advice of the military experts is being disregarded as well, because the people at the center of decision making in the United States are now so deeply committed to this venture that they cannot pull back. Doing so would risk their careers, would open the way perhaps for China to mediate a compromise, a peace in Ukraine, which would be an even bigger disaster from their point of view than an outright Ukrainian defeat. It would mean the failure of their project in both Ukraine and Russia itself. And of course, it would be disastrous for their careers if there was now an admission that this whole thing hasn't worked. What they're going to do instead is that they're going to push Ukraine into an offensive. And if the offensive fails, they will look for others to blame. They will blame President Zelensky with his insistence on defending Bakhmut. They will say this was done against US advice and that Ukraine weakened its defenses by doing this. They will blame the Western allies, the European allies, and there's been a big campaign now against President Macron because of his comments in China about after his visit to China. They will blame the European allies. They will blame the Germans because they didn't provide Ukraine with enough support. I have to say, I think many people in Germany will find that very difficult to swallow after all the sacrifices that Germany has made over the last year. Anyway, they will blame the Germans and they will blame the Republicans and the military in the United States. And we already got a taster of this from that article in The Hill by Mr. Earl Mack that I discussed a couple of videos ago. He was talking about the fact that the Ukrainians themselves are losing hope. Unsurprising, given what we now know, that the Ukrainians are becoming increasingly doubtful that Ukraine can win this war. And we saw Mr. Mack talking about the urgent need to send every kind of piece of military equipment available, tanks, aircraft, F-16s, more M777s. Not sure there's many left now. I've seen reports that the US has sent many more M777s than it's admitted to, and that these have been taken from active military units, active marine units, which would mean that there are Marines apparently standing around without howitzers in the US military, which is not a very attractive idea, but I don't know that that is necessarily the case. Anyway, more M777s, more self-propelled guns, more of everything should be sent to Ukraine, should be sent immediately, should be sent today. And when the offensive fails to achieve victory, however that's defined, I'm not even sure any longer how it is defined, well, it will be blamed on the failure of the offensive will be blamed on the fact